Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special webinar that in recognition of World Suicide Prevention Day. Every year on 10th of September, people and organisations worldwide come together to raise awareness about suicide prevention, and today we're here to contribute to that important conversation. Bond's been working in partnership with Andy from Thriving People, who supports organisations through coaching and other means to build strong and resilient cultures. Thriving People have extensive experience in helping clients such as ITV, Coca-Cola and Client Earth. Today we're also joined by Andy's friend Will Burwood, who's going to share his deeply personal story of his brother James, who tragically took his life in November 2019. So thanks for joining us for today. I'm now going to hand over to Andy and Will to take it away.
Thanks, Lois. Yeah, and we really do appreciate you taking an hour out of your day to engage with what I think for pretty much everyone is a very heavy and uncomfortable topic to talk about, to engage with. So appreciate your courage in being willing to do that, your openness, and that's really our message today, is the importance, the value of being open about mental health. It's improved a lot, people's openness and our societal openness about it. But suicide remains one of those areas of mental health that is still very much a taboo, that people find it very difficult to talk about. So appreciate you being willing to do that. And we'd like it to be a conversation. We'd like to get your questions. As Lois said, we'll talk for about 40 minutes or so and then invite more of a discussion. It's great to see some cameras on. We love being able to see you as we're talking. It feels very weird when we're just talking to kind of black screens with names. Especially because it's such an emotive topic. We know people are feeling things as we're talking, but we can't necessarily sense that when we can't see you. So yeah, thanks very much as well for your introduction, Lois. I am also a mindfulness coach, and I support people with things like stress and anxiety, with depression, with feeling stuck, and help them to feel like it's okay to feel how they feel, and work with teams as well to help them to open up to each other, to have more empathy and trust so that they can be honest with each other about their mental health. And I also run a men's group, which is very much along the same lines. It's a group of guys coming together once a month to be really honest about, this is how I'm really feeling. This is what I'm finding difficult. And some of the guys in that group have talked about feeling suicidal. So it's a topic that comes up a lot in life. So Will, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Will Burwood, steel director by trade. I guess my only link to the mental health side of things is that my brother committed suicide in November 2019. But since then, have wanted to encourage people to be open and talk about suicide in a forthright sort of manner, so that we can help other people from either committing suicide or help other people with, the reactions from people who have committed suicide. However we do that, that's what I want to do.
One of the things I love about doing these sessions with Will is he's very much not your usual suspect when it comes to talking about well-being and mental health. He's a big, burly, 6'2" man.
6'4"
construction. 6'4", sorry, I shaved 2 inches off you.
Yeah, thank you for doing that.
The construction industry is not known for being open about mental health, but what it is known for is having a suicide rate that's 3 times higher than the average. So it feels very important, very valuable to have Will from that kind of background being willing to talk about this topic. The way we met was just after James, who was my friend, who is Will's brother, took his life in 2019. Will got in touch with me and said, there's nothing I would like to do more right now than talk about my brother and share stories about him. So I got in contact with him through Facebook and we became friends. We talked about what had happened with James, but also all sorts of other things. And sometime after that, I got asked by a company if I would like to or be willing to do something for World Suicide Prevention Day a few years ago. And I thought, well, I don't feel qualified myself, but I think if I do this with Will, and we do it as a kind of like a Q&A where we get to hear a very personal experience of what it's like to be affected by suicide, then I think that would be valuable. And we've done it many times now, and people have, I think, found it very, very valuable. And we find it valuable because it's a way to turn something so negative and tragic and horrific into something which has some kind of a positive element to it. We can take something positive from it. And sadly, as I said, suicide is still very much a taboo. It is something that is also very, very common. It's actually going in the wrong direction. The ONS recently brought out some statistics that said that suicide levels in England and Wales are at their highest level since 1999. In England and Wales, 16 people take their life every single day. And so when I read that, it's very easy just to see that as a statistic and not for me not to feel very touched by it. But when I think about 16 Jameses every day, it's horrific to imagine that. Of the people that take their lives, 3 times as many men do it than women, although more women attempt suicide than men do. And I'm looking at the age groups that it affects most. It's 45 to 49 for men and 50 to 55 for women. It's the most common way for a man under 50 to die. It's also one of the most common ways, I think the most common way for a young person under 25 to die. So it affects middle-aged people, also really affects young people. And I want to show these statistics because if we just pay attention to what we hear about in the media, we might not realize how widespread suicide is, how much of a problem it is compared to the things that are in the media a lot. Deaths from war, people committing murder, natural disasters, terrorism. How much more do we hear about terrorism in the media than suicide? And yet it's a fraction of the number of deaths. Of course, they're all important, not to say that terrorism isn't a problem, but that's not reflected in the media. And perhaps what that is a reflection of is that when someone takes their life, it's rarely remarkable. It's literally an everyday thing. And yet we don't talk about it very much. And another thing which is in the media a lot in a way that's very disproportionate to how many people die. I just wanted to put this in because there's been another mass shooting recently in the USA, but the number of people who die from mass shootings is about 700 people every year. And of course, every one of those is a tragedy. And it's horrific to think that children in school don't feel safe and could be attacked by one of their schoolmates with a gun. But the number of people who die by suicide is hugely bigger in the US, and yet it doesn't get the same attention. So it can be very dehumanizing in a way to talk about the statistics around it. And if you'll pardon the pun, Will's talked about having death by PowerPoint from suicide awareness talks, where it's just too much around the statistics and slides. And we want to make this a very personal story. And so this is James. This is my friend. This is Will's brother. What we're going to do is talk about some of the events leading up to the moment where he took his life. We're going to talk about how it affected both of us. We're going to talk about some of the factors that might have led to him being in that suicidal state. We're then going to have some time for Q&A. And then towards the end, I will point you towards some resources, do some signposting for suicide prevention. I met James at something called Morning Gloryville, which was a rave that happened on Wednesday mornings, once a month, that was sober. So no drugs or alcohol. I remember seeing some drunk people who'd been up all night trying to get in and they weren't allowed in. Imagine walking up some steps and thinking, what's going to be in this room? Because you can't really hear very much. It's very soundproofed. And then you open it and there's this kind of whoosh of sound and color, 800 people going crazy, full of energy, glitter, some people dressed as unicorns, having the best time at 7 o'clock in the morning. And the motto of Morning Gloryville was "Rave your way into the day." It was so fun, and that's where I met James. We went for brunch sometimes afterwards. He joined a meditation group that I ran, and we became friends. And we did lots of things together. We went to festivals, we hung out, I got to know him in various different moments, various different situations. And my experience of him, my perception of him was being someone who's very confident, very self-assured. He was a stand-up comedian. He was a very good public speaker. He seemed to be very confident with business and making money, and he would often give me suggestions about how I could be more bold, bolshy about charging more to my clients and being more daring. He seemed to be successful with women and be very confident approaching women, and he had a girlfriend, and from the outside seemed to be doing well, seemed to have lots of friends as well, had his own flat. And so it seemed to me to come out a bit out of the blue when he told me that he'd been hospitalized for anxiety, that he'd had such a bad panic attack that he had to go to hospital. And I'd known he was struggling for some time when he said to me that he was thinking about taking his life. He'd told me that he was struggling, that he was feeling these intense pains in his body, weird shooting sensations up his fingers and arms, and he just didn't know how to get rid of them, struggling with insomnia. He told me that he was thinking about taking his life about 4 days before he did. And I had a friend tell me that they were thinking about killing themselves previously and they hadn't done it. And I thought, maybe it's just another one of those. Maybe he's not really going to do it. The weekend following him telling me this, we were planning to hang out. He'd booked an Airbnb in Kent. We were going to go down as a group of friends, spend the weekend together. And he'd cancelled. He'd said, "I just don't feel up to it. I'm really struggling with my mental health. You guys go." So we were 2 cars driving down to Kent, and James was staying at his parents' house, and we decided we'd call in and just try to give him some support, see how he was doing. And it was the other car that got there first, and I got this phone call while we were at a petrol station from my friend Samantha, and she said that they'd arrived at James's parents' house and she'd had this really intense feeling of foreboding, like we shouldn't be here, and we shouldn't knock on the door. But at the same time, she thought, but this is ridiculous. We've come all this way. I can't not knock on the door. And James and Will's other brother opened the door and said, "You couldn't have come at a worse time. We found James's body this morning." And when she told me this over the phone, I remember being in this state of kind of numbness, this shock of where I just didn't really feel anything to begin with. And I had this sort of worry of like, oh my God, am I not even upset that my friend is dead? And then we met together at a cafe just off the motorway, both of the cars, a group of friends. And then it really hit me with these waves of grief and crying uncontrollably. And we got together as a group of friends that evening to talk about it, to try to piece together what we knew about what had happened and the different things that we tried to do to support him in the previous days and weeks. And cried together. And that was a really cathartic thing to do, for it not to be a sort of thing that we were going off in our separate flats to deal with by ourselves. And it was a few days after that Will got in touch with me saying that there's nothing I want to do right now more than talk about James. So I want to bring Will in at this point, and if you could tell your account of how you found out, or just if you could actually just start a little bit before that, some of the things that built up in the days just before your brother took his life.
Yeah. So a sort of potted history is that he moved back to the UK about 8 months before he committed suicide. And he was living in Canada, was lonely, felt that he wanted to be back near his friends and family. And I'd spoken to him very regularly while he was in Canada, knew that he maybe wasn't feeling great, but hoped that, coming back to the UK, we could G him up a bit and get things back on track. Then maybe 2 or 3 weeks prior to committing suicide, that's when I sort of found out things maybe a little bit deeper than I thought they were. I think that was the first time that he went to hospital. My mum took him to hospital because he was having a panic attack. And then it was maybe sort of 3 days before he committed suicide, on the Wednesday, that I had a chat with him, that he's maybe sort of admitted that he was having suicidal thoughts, but assured me that he wouldn't sort of go through with it. And then I went away on the weekend to Bath, and got a phone call from my dad on the Saturday morning, and he said the line that I'll never forget. He said, "Are you driving?" Which, I mean, my dad just never asked me questions like that, and I just knew straight away that he'd committed suicide. And yeah, I spent probably the next 2 to 3 hours wandering around Bath, crying. And like you said, I'm not a small guy, ex-rugby player, steel erector, 6'4", rolling around Bath crying, was probably quite a sight for some people. And then managed to sort of speak to family, my mum and my dad, managed to speak to some really close friends that my brother has had since he was sort of very, very young. And I've known since I was probably born. And then decided that we'd get back up and get on our way back over to see the rest of my family. And it just, that sort of, those next few days were, in a strange way, like quite uplifting, because sort of whilst it was tinged with huge sadness, being able to laugh as well as much as we cried with friends, that we could tell ridiculous. And my brother was a stand-up comedian in his spare time, and was hilarious, and one of the most ridiculous people I've ever come across. So we had lots of funny stories to talk about, as much as sad times to sort of commiserate over. And yeah, then that's obviously when I sort of decided to reach out and message lots of people online that I hadn't necessarily met, that I knew my brother talked about, like yourself, and just start the process of talking to lots of other people about him.
Yeah. And how would you say it helped you to talk to people about him and what had happened? Because I think that maybe not everyone would react like that. Some people would be very private. Some people would maybe just talk to very, very close friends and family. But you had this kind of quite amazing approach of, I just want to talk to everybody about this.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's from my background, maybe it's being a third child. Yeah, that I don't know. But yeah, I just I was, so I could. The sad thing for me, in reality, is that whilst James was my brother, he was also one of my sort of 5 or 6 best friends. So I lost, quite a lot in that sort of situation, and I just thought to myself that I want to talk to people about him. I want it to not be, the taboo, or I wanted people to know that whilst I was and the family was grieving, that they also had their own grief, and that I found it so good to talk to his friends that I just thought I wanted to do that myself. So opened lines of communication with lots of people. And it helped me. It helped me being able to talk about him, make it not a sort of behind closed doors affair, or that I was somehow going to hide it away. That I wanted to sort of talk about it and just make sure that it was sort of front and center.
And you had a sense that somehow it was helping the people you were talking to about it as well.
Yeah, I think maybe that's maybe it's a post-rationalization that I did it to help other people. But I had found there was a previous time prior to my brother dying, that my other brother went through a really horrible divorce and court case. And I found his reaction was to close down and not talk about certain things. And my reaction was to open up and talk to everyone about it. And by doing that, you realise there's far more people that have been through the same situation as you than you ever thought, because they didn't talk about it. That there's other people who've got other things going on in their life that they probably need to talk to someone about, but don't talk to them about because they don't want to be a burden. And a good example of that is about a week after James died. I live in a town on the edge of London, and I'd normally travel into London at the same time as a friend of James's, but we weren't close enough that we had each other's number. We'd just chat on the train. But I knew he'd want to know, so I tried to get hold of him on Facebook. I couldn't do that. He wasn't using it. And then, a week or so later, I was going up to London to meet another one of James's friends, and he sort of came around the corner while I was outside the station. He was running late for a train. I was a bit early, and we just managed to sort of be at the same time, at the same place. And he was all smiles and beaming. And obviously, when I told him what had happened, he was a massive shock and he was really upset. But on that train journey up to London, he opened up sort of about his own mental health struggles. That he had a long-term health condition that was really getting him down, and that he wasn't opening up to his wife about how bad he was feeling. And by the end of the train journey, he'd sort of set himself that he's going to tell his wife, he's going to, get the support he needs from work. He worked for a big company, and they were offering him the support that he needed. And I just realised by me sort of being open and honest about my situation allowed him the space to sort of do the same. And I was that's kind of what set me on this path. So I fell into it by accident, really, Andy.
Sorry?
I fell into it by accident, to be honest with you.
Well, it sounds like it was kind of experimentation, observing what other people do, what impact that had, and what seemed to feel good for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's fingers crossed it's worked ever since.
Yeah. Can you say a bit more about the emotional response? So in the short term, in the days after, and then the longer term, how you dealt with the feelings that what feelings came up, and how you dealt with them?
Yeah, well, everything you can imagine. I mean, initial huge sadness, to anger, anger at James for committing suicide, anger at myself that maybe I didn't do enough, regret, guilt, all of them you sort of run through, maybe at different periods of time. I think the sort of, I guess I think I heard a saying from, of all people, Liam Neeson, about his wife's death, which was that it's almost like grief's like an ocean, and it kind of, sometimes it'll be nice and calm, and you won't be thinking about it, and you're like a little boat, and you're just floating along, and then suddenly a big wave will come and sort of wash over you, and that could be any one of those emotions. And I tend to find that it was November the 16th that he committed suicide, but without realising it, about 2 weeks prior to November the 16th on every year, I start to get this sort of, don't sleep as well. I start to feel a bit more ratty than I was, a bit more anxious about things. And then you realise, it's coming up to the anniversary, and you don't really think about it until then. But I think, those are the major ones. I mean, the anger one was quite a funny one. I have on my shelf in front of me a turquoise Ralph Lauren cap that he used to wear, and he hated the fact that I smoked, because he was a bit of a health freak. So one day, in my fit of anger, I went out and chain smoked a load of cigarettes wearing his hat. Sort of just looking up and telling him that, I'll do what I like, thank you very much. It doesn't work.
Yeah, so there's sadness, there's anger, there's guilt. Can you say a bit about the guilt? Because this comes up so much with suicide, doesn't it? Like, what could I have done differently? What if only I'd done this? If only I'd been there for them more? If only I'd called them more? If only. What was your relationship with that?
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, there was some level of that question. I mean, it's always the what if, isn't it? It's sort of, what could I have done differently? I think I was relatively good at transferring that question to, would I have done anything different? Like, sort of looking back and thinking, if I knew the same information as I knew at the time, would I have done anything different? And that answer was always no for me. So I kind of managed to manage that side of it myself. But I think an example of it for my mum is the biggest one. Is he was living with her at the time, and she kind of woke up at about midnight, thinking that my brother had gone for a wee or something in the night, just went back to sleep, and it turns out that was almost certainly the time that he left the house to go and commit suicide. So she definitely has felt that why didn't I get up? Why didn't I do something? But it's a tricky one, because you're always going to ask those questions, but I always came back to that it was sort of James's choice in a way. If I gave him his agency, that it was his choice to do it, it was his life to do it, as much as I'm not happy about it, and I don't believe it was the right choice, that he was able to, if you give him his agency, then you're able to relieve yourself of the guilt that you might feel. And I don't think it's fair to feel that guilt, because if you love a family member or friend or whoever, then you're only ever going to do the best you possibly can, and that's all you ever can do.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful point, that if you accept that it's their choice, it's their responsibility, it's what they wanted to do, then that helps you to not beat yourself up, to feel guilty that if I'd done this, it would have changed them. it would have influenced them enough to make a different choice, and maybe that's just not true.
No, I think with hindsight, there are things that there are specific things that you can do that I think you're going to point to more specifically later, so I won't go into them. But there are definitely things that I've learned post suicide that you can do differently to what I might have done, but that may still not have been enough. And that's the reality. And that's why I think it's key to give them their agency back and say, I did everything I possibly could, everything in a open and loving way, but maybe it wasn't enough.
Yeah, and I think there's something quite humble about what we're doing here. Is we're not saying follow these steps and you prevent suicide, because we did everything we could think of to do, and it didn't prevent James's suicide. And maybe
and to be fair as well, and this is what happens when you talk about it with agency, is that he did everything that he thought he could do.
Yeah.
When you when I look back at through messages, he contacted different therapists. He was trying to understand the problem more. He went to see mental health services. He went to hospital twice. Like, he did everything he could do as well. And admittedly, I think I have to reiterate, I do think he was wrong. But then you're not dealing with someone in that state that's of sound mind necessarily. So while I think he was wrong, and I think we could have gotten the help, and I'd loved him to have been here and seen all the wonderful things like birth of my daughter and all of that sort of stuff, that it was his choice ultimately.
Okay, I want to talk a bit about some of the things that can be the risk factors and the triggering events for suicide, and then relate that back to James and whether or not these were relevant to him. So these aren't things that if someone is experiencing this, that will definitely lead to suicide, but they can contribute to the conditions that where someone might feel suicidal. So it's a risk factor if you know someone has tried it in the past, if they've used drugs and alcohol, if they've got a mental disorder like depression or anxiety, if they know someone, particularly a family member, who has killed themselves, if they're lonely, if they have a chronic disease or disability, if they don't have access to professional mental health care that's effective. And then there are specific things that might happen just before. So a trigger event can be a breakdown of a relationship, a death, an arrest, getting into debt, having serious financial problems. There are certain warning signs, and these can be things you see, but then it's also, I think, almost become a cliche to hear that someone, father of four, seemed very happy, had a great job, and out of the blue he took his life. Sometimes you just don't see any warning signs for suicide, and sometimes you do. Sometimes they might talk about feeling unbearable pain, and they might be fascinated by death, feel hopeless, worthless, trapped, might feel a lot of guilt, shame, or anger. You might feel they're a burden. You might see some changes in their behavior or in their mood, like alcohol or increased drug use. They might stop looking after themselves. They might withdraw. Their eating and sleeping patterns might change. They might become violent, or they might have been a victim of violence. They might be reckless. So just reflecting on those, Will, which of those would you say apply to James's situation?
Certainly he had, and I don't know exactly the terminology. I think he used the terminology sort of psychosomatic type of pains. He had pains in his arms, sort of burning sensations that he used to talk about. I don't know whether you mentioned their sort of sleep patterns. Certainly for a number of years, due to things like anxiety, he was not a great sleeper. But towards the end, I mean, it was insomnia to the sort of extreme. Like, I mean, there was a period when he was in Canada that I think his colleague had to take him to hospital in Winnipeg because he hadn't slept for like 7 or 8 days, and that might even be an understatement. And I think in terms of the sort of other bits that were on there, yeah, maybe a sense of shame or guilt. I mean, from his point of view, I think, and this is all sort of hindsight, but he had gone to Canada and he'd invested some money in a business. It wasn't maybe heading the way he thought it was. Again, the question mark as to whether or not that was because of the way he was feeling rather than the reality of the situation. But I think he came back to the UK knowing that he needed to come back to be closer to his friends and family for the support. But then I think with a deep sense of shame and remorse that, maybe he felt a failure when it was far from the truth.
Can you share that story where he was kind of slagging you off and retrospective kind of?
You love that story, don't you? I don't know why you do. Yeah, so about 2 weeks before, I can laugh about it now, but 2 weeks before he died, we went out for a walk. There's quite a nice walk near where we used to do near where I live. And as we were walking along, I told him fairly recently, about a month before, that my then girlfriend was pregnant and we were going to have a baby, which he was quite excited about. But so we were chatting and he sort of remarked that I was, let me get the wording right, unambitious, not driven, and not successful. But I had a long-term partner that I was sort of deeply in love with. We bought a house together and we're having a baby, and it was all the things that he wanted.
Wasn't the phrase something like "You've got everything and I've got nothing"?
Something along those lines. I don't know if that was the exact words, but and I think the reflection was if you sort of mirror it, that he was ambitious and driven and successful, which he was, but all of that for him at the time was paled into insignificance. That all the things he really wanted were a deep connection with a loving partner, a chance of having children, and a settled lifestyle. So I think that is. I laugh about it. I laughed at the time, to be fair. I think I might have called him a few blue words, but we were quite open and honest with each other. So I really didn't take any of that to heart particularly. But that is quite an interesting look into the sort of psyche at the time, that I think he maybe had some pretty deep regrets.
Yeah, I find it a powerful story because I saw him as being a very successful person, but so often the way we see people is not the same way they see themselves, right? And he clearly, it sounds like he really saw himself as a failure in many ways.
Well, and it depends on what success really means. Yeah. And I think, he was 39, coming towards 40. I think he'd always wanted to have children, but maybe put off having long-term relationships while he built a business and then built a career and then built a business. And I think it's what, maybe it was the time of life that he was in, maybe it was the way he was feeling at the time, but I think maybe you just question what is really success in life.
Yeah, and I think I'm now 39, so I know from experience that it can feel like a very high pressure time of life where there's this sort of expectation of at this age you should be settling down, have a house, have kids, have a good income, and if you don't have those things, it can be a source of shame of I'm not good enough. I'm not where I should be in life.
Without a doubt, yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to pause now, and we've got some things to share around signposting and things that can make suicide less likely, the sort of factors that can help with that. But is there anyone who'd like to either unmute or on the chat ask a question?
Hi. Hi, Andy and Will.
Hi, Andy.
It's Ollie here. So I was just wondering, do you feel like as people that have been bereft from suicide, that you've been able to access support, um, therapy? Is you offered support from anywhere, or is it all quite isolating?
Do you want to go for that,
Yep,
Will?
do you want me to go ahead? Yeah. Well, so there was no offer of support from any sort of third party specifically. I had myself, my girlfriend at the time had used a counsellor to get her through some anxiety issues previously, and she seemed quite good. She was quite a gruff Scottish lady, which I thought for me was what I needed, rather than someone who's going to pat me on the head sort of thing. So I found her really interesting, and she did have some experience with specifically sort of suicide as a way of grief counselling, and that sort of helped me come to terms with a lot of things. I think my mum found a group therapy, which I think we'll have in the last slide, called SOBS, which is the survivors of bereavement through suicide, and that was for her, I think, quite empowering, because it was seeing she wasn't alone in it. Even though you're not, you've got your family and friends around you, but it's a strange one when you mention that someone has died through an illness, and it's a strange one, because I get it. You get the head tilt when you say it's suicide, because it's not something that people have necessarily been through themselves. So yeah, I think that helped her for sure.
It's not something that I've had professional help with, but I've just found it helpful being able to be open about it in a similar way to Will, being able to talk to friends and family. I remember the first time that I came into my workspace, I had this sort of sense that I shouldn't talk about it because it's such a heavy, upsetting thing. And sitting in a circle with a group of people and telling them and feeling unburdened by that, and feeling their care and feeling their support, and being part of a group where we'd all been affected by it, and being able to talk about it with each other was really supportive.
Yeah, I think that also, just quickly on that word burden, we didn't touch on that too much throughout the talk, but I found myself, when I talk about suicide with other people, and I talk about my brother committing suicide, I could feel like I was burdening them with my issue, but actually conversely, or sort of how in reverse, actually, what I feel like is that while it allowed me to unburden my feelings, the other person then is able to unburden themselves, because you open a space for people to talk to each other, and that's quite an interesting help. I mean, the most amazing thing for me was to talk to people about my brother committing suicide, and I can be a bit of a sledgehammer. I can sort of insert it into most conversations. So, it can be quite brutal, but I almost like that shock factor, and it allows people to go, oh, okay, this is a place we can talk about anything then. And that's I found that really interesting for me.
Yeah, it's skipping straight from the small talk and jumping in the deep end, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not good for first dates. So don't get me wrong.
Can I ask a question? And thank you so much, both of you. You talked about thinking about whether or not there's anything that you could have done that might have prevented it. Just thinking about the role that all of us can play in society to try and help prevent future suicides. Can you think of anything that anyone, that society could have done? What would it have taken? What can you think of anything that might have prevented it?
Wow, the $1 million question, Martin. Thank you. There were a quick specific for me, which I actually only really talked about openly for the first time on the weekend with my dad, and he felt the same, is that in our ineptitude, no, not understanding mental health, maybe as well as I do now, on the Wednesday prior to my brother dying, we all went down there, and we all tried to gee him up and tried to get him to feel better about it. And don't worry, we're all here to support you. And in reality, specifically in my brother's case, and I think this is more of a male thing than female thing, but specifically to my brother, I actually think the timeline of events showed that was probably the night that he decided to commit suicide. And the reality is, I think, whilst I don't judge myself for it because you're doing it out of love, the reality is that actually by going and doing that, maybe he felt more of a burden than he really was. And that it's a really tricky one. I think societally, I just want people to talk about it more. I want people to talk about it openly, but not just. I don't want it to. What the reason for these conversations with me and Andy when we set it up and we talked about it. I hate PowerPoint slides. I don't like them. I've sat through so many of them where I nearly fell asleep. I want people to talk about something meaningful. And I think with my brother, my big takeaway that I probably would have done differently is actually at the time I'd found out I was going to be a parent for the first time. And that comes along with a lot of things you think about, stresses, anxieties. But because of the situation he was in, I didn't want to burden him with it, that word burden again. And whereas I think possibly, and there's nothing that can prove this, but possibly I think if I had been more open with him, that maybe he would have been more open with me, but also maybe he would feel more protective of a factor that he wanted to stay around for that and help me. So specifically, those are the things I think I could have done different. As a society, I just think we just need to talk about it way more, and just be less closed off about it as a subject matter.
Yeah, as you say, well, it is the $1 million question, and I think I absolutely agree that the vulnerability of going first is so powerful. Like this is what I'm struggling with. This is what it's like to be me. There's really profound questions about how do we support each other to not feel ashamed of ourselves, to not feel like who we are isn't good enough, that we feel we should be somehow more successful, we should be a better version of ourselves than who we really are. It seems to be one big area that I think there's no simple solution to, but maybe being open about your own levels of self-criticism and self-doubt and not being good enough can sometimes help with that. And then something which he talked about to me as being part of the situation, that maybe there wasn't a solution to, maybe there wasn't anything he could have done differently, but he was saying he was sort of going down these YouTube rabbit holes of how do I fix this? How do I get out of this pain, mental and physical, that I'm feeling? And he said, I keep coming across this idea that I need to accept how I feel. I need to accept my feelings, and I just can't do that. And many people can't. Many people, why are we always scrolling on our phones? Because we don't like how we feel. Why do we overeat? Why do we undereat? Why do we watch too much porn, or whatever it is we do? We don't like feeling how we feel. So how do we as a society, well, why do we take drugs, even whether it's antidepressants or cocaine? So how do we as a society help each other to feel that it's okay to feel how you feel? And how do we help each other to have that tolerance, that resilience, that it's I can deal with my feelings. I know this is Will who just said how much he hates PowerPoint, but I do have a slide for this. After the warning signs,
it's necessary sometimes, I guess.
just a little bit. So effective professional support, counselor, therapist, coach can be a protective factor. It's important to say effective professional support, because there's a lot of ineffective professional support. Connectedness, which was obviously something we can all engage with. We can all reach out to friends. We can all join groups. We can all call our friends and family. Healthy lifestyle and habits, something you can do individually, but also you can support each other to do that. Self-esteem and sense of purpose or meaning, really, really important, really big question, how you help each other to connect with that, or if you don't have that, how you find that for yourself. But it's really, really a big part of whether people feel like they want to be alive or not. And mindfulness and self-compassion, which I am a mindfulness coach, and I didn't put this there because I thought of it, but I read it on a website where it's talking about preventing suicide. And a big part of what mindfulness and self-compassion is about is sometimes described as the window of tolerance, expanding what you're able to tolerate, the sensation, the emotion, being able to accept what you're experiencing, accept that my mind is busy, accept that I'm feeling this panic or this anger or whatever it is, and meet that experience kindly, compassionately. And that's a practice, that's a training. It's something that you can do by yourself, you can do with apps, YouTube videos. It's something you can do in courses and groups, and have it as a collective experience. And just want to do a little bit of signposting as well as we come to the last few minutes. So if people are feeling desperate, if it's in the moment when someone is feeling suicidal, calling the Samaritans, calling the campaign against living miserably, that's a resource that's there. You can also message them. You don't have to speak. I want to flag men's groups. I've run one myself where we have talked about suicide several times, people in the group feeling suicidal. And I feel that it's a support, it's a protective factor that we can talk about that openly with each other. Mine's not an open one, but there's men's groups like Men Speak, which is online and in person. There's one called Andy's Man Club. I'm Andy, but it's a different Andy. And it was set up by someone whose brother killed themselves. And Will's already mentioned SOBs, so there are support groups for the families of people who've taken their lives. I want to flag that a lot of workplaces now have mental health first aiders that are trained to talk to people who are feeling suicidal. Many organizations now have counseling and coaching available for staff. And that's also something, we don't specifically help with suicide as thriving people, but what we do is we help companies and teams to create spaces where they feel safer to open up with each other, sometimes called psychological safety. So if you feel like your team's not where you'd like it to be in terms of that sort of emotional openness with each other, I'd be very happy to have a chat with you about that. So I think that's everything we wanted to cover. That's all the signposting. Unless there's anything else you wanted to add to that, Will, or does anyone else want to flag anything in terms of resources around suicide?
Not from me. Just any other questions as well? If anyone wants to ask, I just want everyone to ask whatever questions they can. Yeah, we just got another sort of 3 minutes or so. If anyone else wants to ask something.
Do you mind if I ask a question?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Just firstly, thanks, Will and Andy, for being so open about such a difficult issue. I imagine it's not easy at all. This is really, it's quite a tricky one, and I'm not expecting there to be an answer. But I've had situations where I've had members of staff who are responsible for having attempted to commit suicide, and just wondering, because one of the issues was trying to get them to be back in work, but not feeling kind of like overworked or overburdened by having kind of things taken away from them. So it's quite kind of a big challenge to be able to kind of like do what you can as the employer, to not make them, I guess, to not push them and become a risk factor for them, or a trigger point, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, like I said, I'm not expecting there to be a kind of solution, but it's a kind of an issue that I've faced it a few times actually over the years, and never really kind of found kind of an answer to kind of how you can try and do the best you can for that individual. At the same time, you've got the pressures of obviously work and trying to get things done in the organisation. So there's pressure also to get that individual to be back in work and working at full capacity. So any words of wisdom would be welcome. But I appreciate it's not an easy one.
Awesome question, to be honest with you. Thank you. Look, none of it is, for me, I can only talk as a general perspective. Everything I have learned about mental health prior to my brother shows me that it's really counterintuitive. So from what I can gather, most men try to commit suicide because they feel burdensome or that they have no purpose. So I believe with my brother, for example, getting to 40, no kids, no long-term partner, and I think he felt like all the work he'd done to set up a business and a career was useless without that as well. So I believe that a lot of mental health interactions with normal people can be quite counterintuitive. So actually, you might find with some of your staff, actually giving them more purpose is actually really good for them. Do you see what I mean? So it has to be sort of a holistic approach in that sense. And then other stuff, it might mean that they really need the pressure taken off, and then maybe they need, change of role, change of team, whatever it might be. You never know. I think it's the tricky thing. I think the problem we suffer from in the UK massively is our mental health services just are not adequate. And I don't blame them for that. I mean, they're massively stretched. They're underfunded, and they're really trying their best. But that would be a massive help for everyone if that was a different situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any advice, Andy, from a more business perspective?
Well, we're running out of time, I'm afraid, but I just want to acknowledge how difficult it must be to have people in your team that have tried to commit suicide, and the stress and anxiety that you might do something that might make it worse for them in the future, and the pressure of trying to improve their situation must be really, really a lot. When we talked about burden, that really does sound like a heavy burden to have to deal with. I just want to acknowledge that.
And just very, very quickly, I think my message is always be open. If you're feeling that, tell them. Genuinely, say, I really don't know how best to help. Let's talk about it. Because by you opening up about your vulnerability about that situation might get them to say something that actually gets you forward, rather than you thinking, well, I don't want to say anything because of this, or they don't want to say anything because of that. So for me, it's to always be open.
Yeah, and I think that's a great note to end on, because that's really our core message. That the more we can be open about these things, and if we can go first and be the one who's vulnerable first, then that gives other people the space to be open themselves.
Without doubt, yeah.
Thanks again for everyone for being willing to take the time to engage with this, for your questions, for your attention, and I hope that you feel inspired to be a bit more open, to talk to people around you that you feel safe that you trust. And wishing you all the best, wishing you a great rest of the day.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
No, thank you all.
We'd love to get
Thanks
your
so much.
feedback on the
Thanks.
feedback form. We'll send you one in the follow-up email.
Thank you.